I talked about this briefly in a different video, but let's talk about a true sequel. I'm going to try to remember to put it in quotes, true, because a sequel is a sequel, right? What do I mean by a true sequel? For me, the best way to define a true sequel is through a philosophy of development. If your default answer to how will we do a thing is the same way we did it in the game that we are following, then to my mind, that makes you a true sequel. If the answer to how do we reveal new parts of the map is, well, in the previous game, you climbed something tall in order to do it, then even though the previous game, that really tall thing was a radio tower, and in this thing, it's a tree, I would still say that you are a true sequel. You may not have the same IP. You may not have the same gameplay for all aspects of your game. But if the philosophy is, by default, the starting point is whatever the game that came before did, we're going to assume we are going to do it that way unless we have a reason and a discussion about why it should change. So what are some examples of true sequels? In the case of sports games, year to year, they are usually true sequels. You take the game that just shipped and that becomes the starting point for your next game. That's fairly obvious, right? You're not going to change a bunch of ways that the game plays year to year. You're going to pick a few features that you're going to focus on. This year, it's all about defense, or it's all about ball physics, or it's all about a couple of things. Everything else is going to stay relatively similar. You're going to incrementally change some of your art or some of your performance metrics. What you do see in sports titles is when there is something that changes the dynamic of the way they're developing, sometimes they end up with a game that isn't a true sequel. This often happens when the engine has to change or it's a new console generation. And in those cases, you actually see something potentially bad happen in a lot of cases. Is what happens is because you've come to the game with a more blank sheet of paper and your development philosophy usually is to make true sequels, you can often have a version of NHL or a version of NBA where this version is less fully featured than the version that came before because you've deviated from that incremental philosophy and you've made some missteps and you've lost your way. Certainly for the sports teams at EA, the hardest time for them is when they are unable to act in this true sequel way, when they are switching to Frostbite or when they are changing console generations. Those are the hardest times for those sports titles. But also, a true sequel is, I would say that most of the games built by Bethesda are true sequels. Even though you are bouncing between Elder Scrolls and Fallout, they are building upon the things that came before. Fallout 4 isn't using the combat mechanics of Skyrim, but it's adopting the base level technology and philosophy to the way that the open world works. This simplifies your playing field and gives you a head up, a start that you otherwise wouldn't have. When you look in BioWare's history, really there haven't been a ton of true sequels. Baldur's Gate 2 is a true sequel to Baldur's Gate 1. Mass Effect 3 is a true sequel to Mass Effect 1 and 2. Dragon Age 2, true sequel to Dragon Age Origins. The rest of them really aren't. You could actually argue that KOTOR and Jade Empire are kind of true sequels to Neverwinter Nights, but I think that's a bit of a stretch. But if you actually look, Mass Effect 2 undertakes massive re-architecture to its codebase, changes its philosophy around the way that it does combat. Dragon Age Inquisition changes the way that it approaches exploration and is on a brand new engine. BioWare has struggled with convergence between the different franchises, and as a result, there is a lot of retreading of similar ground. What I mean by that is that the inventory screen has been implemented pretty much from scratch on almost every single game that BioWare has ever made. Usually because there is a philosophical departure from what we're talking about, where there is not the assumption that things will be the same as the previous game without a good reason. But the reality is that something like the inventory screen, there's only really so many patterns that make sense there from a gameplay perspective. So what ends up happening is a game spends a ton of time exploring the space and usually ends up landing at roughly the same place as the game that was before. And this is, for me, one of the major advantages that a true sequel philosophy can get you. It removes some of the wheel spinning that can occur on some of these repeatable features. And what that does is it frees up your team to actually think about places where maybe some innovation is deserved. If you're making a Mass Effect game, but you've decided it's going to be a true sequel to the previous Dragon Age game, and as a result, you know how exploration is going to work, you know how jumping is going to work, you know how the inventory system is going to work, you know how conversation is going to work. It frees you up to spend your dev cycles on making sure that combat's really awesome and different from Dragon Age. So it seems like true sequels are awesome. Everyone should be doing them. Why is there this resistance to them? I think there are two primary reasons. The first is that there's something in software engineering called not invented here syndrome, which encapsulates this disdain or discrediting of systems that weren't built inside of the team that's having to use them. Sometimes you get this even within a single team. And the reason why this happens is there is a ramp up to adopting a piece of technology or a piece of design or a piece of content that was built by someone else. So it's very easy to think, well, I could do this better and faster if I just started from a blank sheet of paper. But the reality is almost always that assumption is incorrect. So that's problem one, is not invented here syndrome. The second thing is that often what happens is that teams focus on how they are different from the game that came before, as opposed to all the ways that they are the same. Mass Effect and Dragon Age, to the Mass Effect and Dragon Age teams, feel immensely different from each other. But the reality is they are both RPGs with a party, and you have conversations and an inventory, you level up. It's really only different in the specifics of the way that combat works. So by getting stuck in this mindset of thinking about the way that your game is different, as opposed to embracing the ways that you are the same, you end up, again, traversing a lot of ground to end up back where you started in a lot of cases. Now, it is possible to take this concept too far, to essentially just take a game and stamp it out a couple more times and make almost no changes to it. Certainly, this is something that sometimes happens with sports titles, that where year over year, they're not changing very much and people start to get fatigued on that. That accusation has been made against some of the Assassin's Creeds as well. But my fundamental belief is that by approaching development of true sequels correctly, you're actually opening the door for really impactful differences. Schedule the time for some things to be different. Plan things to be different. But don't start from a blank sheet of paper when 3/4 of your outline is already done. So, yay for true sequels. I hope to see them more, and I will continue to fight the internet on asset and content reuse. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link down in the description. We also have a merch shop. This is 2DA Forever, which really goes back into BioWare's past. There's a shelf below this video if you're interested in buying something to support the channel as well. What do you think? True sequels? You want them all dead? Do you want every single thing to be different in every single game that ever comes out forever? You're wrong, but tell me why you think that in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.